In fact, there comes a moment when you don't raise your voice, don't explain, don't chai sand, suddenly everything changes. Not because you planned revenge, but because something inside you went quiet. And that quiet, it dismantled everything they thought they controlled. You stopped caring, but not in bitterness, not in anger. You stopped caring in alignment. And that is the kind of shift that shakes foundations. See, avoidants thrive on imbalance, on distance that keeps you leaning forward, on uncertainty that keeps you questioning your worth. Their game only works when you keep investing emotional energy into what gives nothing back. But the day you withdrew your attention not as punishment but as protection, the rules changed. You didn't become cold. You became clear. And clarity is dangerous to anyone who survives on confusion. When you stopped explaining yourself, they felt exposed. When you stopped asking for reassurance, they felt the loss of control. When you stopped reacting, they were, in fact, left alone with themselves. That hits different. Because avoidance isn't strength, it's fear dressed up as independence. And when fear realizes it no longer has access to your emotions, it panics. Not loudly, quietly, internally, deeply. You see, divine order never asks you to beg for connection. What is meant to meet you will move toward you in truth, not retreat into silence. And when you finally honored that principle, you stepped out of the cycle. You chose peace over proving, alignment over attachment, self-respect over survival love. And here's the wisdom most people miss. Detachment is not disconnection, it is discernment. You didn't stop caring because you were weak. You stopped caring because you became whole. That's why it shook them. Because your absence was not loud, but it was final. Because your stillness reflected everything they refused to face. And the moment you stopped playing your role, the game collapsed. This is the sacred lesson. When you return to yourself, everything that relied on your self-abandonment begins to unravel. Not by force, by truth. Stay there. Stay grounded. Stay aligned. Because when you stop caring from a place of inner authority, you don't lose love, you reclaim your power. There is a moment of awakening that happens quietly, almost invisibly, when you stop chasing and start choosing yourself. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic declarations. It arrives as a subtle internal shift, a decision made in the deepest part of your spirit that says, I will no longer abandon myself to be understood. And in that moment, the entire dynamic changes. Avoidants lose power not because you confronted them, but because you removed yourself from the position that made their behavior effective. Chasing feeds avoidance. It gives it oxygen. The more you pursue, explain, reassure, or overextend, the more the imbalance solidifies. Avoidants unconsciously rely on this imbalance. They feel safe when they are needed but not required to show up. Affect fully. They feel in control when someone else is emotionally invested while they remain distant. But the instant you stop chasing, that illusion collapses. Power shifts not outwardly but internally. Choosing yourself is not rejection, it is realignment. It is the sacred act of turning your attention back to your own emotional truth. When you stop chasing, you stop asking someone else to validate your worth. You stop negotiating your needs. You stop shrinking your expectations to fit their comfort. And that self-choice creates a vacuum where their old strategies no longer work. What makes this so destabilizing for avoidants is that their power never came from strength, it came from your availability. From your willingness to stay engaged despite inconsistency. From your hope that if you loved harder, explained better, or waited longer, things would change. When that hope is redirected inward, the dynamic loses its grip. This is not about punishment or withdrawal as a tactic. That would, in fact, still be chasing in disguise. This is about self-return, about recognizing that your energy is sacred and finite, and that connection should never require self-erasure. When you choose yourself, you stop orbiting someone else's emotional limits and begin standing firmly in your own center. Avoidants often interpret this shift as sudden coldness or indifference, but that's because they confuse access with intimacy. What they're really feeling is the loss of leverage. Your emotional independence removes the pressure they once avoided, but also the reassurance they secretly depended on. Without your pursuit, they are left to confront their own distance. And here's the deeper truth. When you choose yourself, you are no longer playing a role, you are living in truth. You are no longer asking, how do I keep this connection? You are asking, does this connection honor who I am becoming? That question alone changes everything. Self-choice doesn't close your heart, it grounds it. It allows low, effect V to flow from wholeness rather than need. It replaces anxiety with discernment, and discernment is something avoidance cannot manipulate. This is why the shift feels so powerful. You didn't overpower anyone. You didn't demand change. You simply stepped back into yourself. And when you did, the imbalance corrected itself. What once felt confusing becomes obvious. What once felt magnetic becomes misaligned. Power was never about control. It was always about self-possession. And the moment you chose yourself, you reclaimed it. Emotional withdrawal has a way of revealing truths that words never could. When you step back not in anger, not in protest, but in awareness, you expose the imbalance that once lived quietly beneath the surface. Avoidants often survive in relationships where effort is uneven, where one heart leans forward while the other stays guarded. As long as that imbalance remains unchallenged, it feels normal, familiar, even justified. But the moment you withdraw emotionally, in fact in a grounded, self-honoring way, the imbalance becomes undeniable. This kind of withdrawal is not avoidance mirrored back. It is consciousness. It is the recognition that connection cannot be sustained by one person's emotional labor alone. When you stop overfunctioning, stop initiating every conversation, stop filling the silence, stop regulating both emotions, the dynamic loses its cover. What was once disguised as needing space is revealed as emotional absence. Avoidants are often comfortable when they hold distance because it protects them from vulnerability, but they are deeply unsettled when distance is no longer one-sided. When you withdraw emotionally, you remove the contrast that made their detachment feel invisible. Suddenly, there is no one bridging the gap, no one smoothing over the discomfort, no one absorbing the weight of uncertainty. And that is when the imbalance stands exposed. What makes this exposure so powerful is that it requires no confrontation, no accusation, in fact, no explanations. Your calm withdrawal becomes the truth teller. It communicates without words, I see what is happening and I will no longer carry it alone. That message disrupts the dynamic far more than emotional pleas ever could. In many cases, avoidants rely on the other person's emotional consistency to stabilize the relationship while they remain internally disengaged. Your presence becomes the glue. Your effort becomes the structure. But when you step back emotionally, the structure weakens. Not because you took something away, but because you stopped supplying what was never meant to be one-sided. This exposure often triggers discomfort, confusion, or even sudden pursuit from the avoidant, not necessarily because they have transformed, but because the imbalance is no longer being managed for them. They feel the absence of emotional availability they once took for granted, and in that absence, they are confronted with their own role. Emotional withdrawal also clarifies you, in fact, our own perception. When you stop pouring energy into sustaining the connection, you begin to see it as it truly is, not as it could be, not as you hoped it would become. You notice who reaches out and who stays silent, who leans in and who remains distant. The truth becomes simple, even if it is painful. There is a divine principle at work here. Truth reveals itself in stillness. When you stop striving, clarity emerges. Emotional withdrawal creates that stillness. It removes the noise of overgiving and allows reality to speak. This is not about hardening your heart. It is about protecting it. It is about refusing to participate in a dynamic that requires your emotional depletion. And in doing so, you expose the imbalance not to shame anyone, but to honor yourself. Because once the imbalance is visible, you can no longer pretend it isn't there, and neither can they. Silence carries a different weight when it is born from self-respect rather than fear. There is a kind of quiet that comes, in fact, from anxiety where you don't speak because you're afraid of losing connection. And then there is a sacred silence, the kind that rises when you finally decide not to betray yourself anymore. That silence is not empty. It is full of awareness. And when rooted in self-respect, it becomes a mirror that others cannot avoid. Avoidants are often most comfortable in emotional noise. Explanations, reassurances, repeated conversations, emotional processing, these things keep attention outward and pressure diffused. As long as you are talking, clarifying, reaching, they don't have to sit with themselves. But when you choose silence from a grounded place, the noise disappears. And what remains is reflection. This silence is not the silent treatment. It is not manipulation or withdrawal meant to provoke. It is the natural pause that happens when you realize your words are no longer being met with presence. You stop speaking not to punish, but because there is nothing left to explain. And that decision, in fact, changes everything. When you stop filling the space, the other person is forced to encounter the space themselves. Your absence of reaction removes the buffer that once protected them from accountability. The mirror appears. And mirrors are uncomfortable for those who avoid self-examination. In that mirror, they see their distance. They see the unanswered messages. They see the emotional gaps you once tried to bridge. Not because you pointed them out, but because your silence illuminated them. Self-respecting silence does not argue. It does not chase closure. It trusts that what is meant to understand you will not require endless clarification. It carries the energy of, I know my truth, and I no longer need to convince you of it. That energy is deeply unsettling to anyone who relied on your emotional labor to maintain equilibrium. What makes this silence so powerful is its neutrality. There is no blame to deflect, no emotion to manage, no narrative to control. The avoidant is left alone with their own behavior and the impact of it. And for someone who avoids inward awareness, this can feel confronting. At the same time, this silence transforms you. In the absence of constant explanation, your nervous system begins to settle. You reclaim energy that was once spent monitoring responses, interpreting mixed signals, and hoping for consistency. You begin to listen inward instead of outward. And in that listening, your clarity sharpens. There is a divine wisdom in knowing when to speak and when to be still. Silence, when aligned, is not weakness, it is authority. It communicates boundaries without aggression. It honors truth without debate, and it protects your dignity in ways words sometimes cannot. This is why it hits different, because they expected pursuit, emotion, or reaction. What they encountered instead was peace. And peace is not something avoidance can negotiate with. Your silence became a mirror, not because you intended it to be, but because truth reflected. Respect tease naturally when there is nothing left to hide behind. Detachment is often misunderstood as indifference, as if releasing emotional attachment means you no longer care. But true detachment is not the absence of feeling, it is the presence of clarity. It is the moment you stop gripping what hurts you and start seeing it for what it is. And that shift from entanglement to awareness is not cruelty. It is honesty with yourself. When you are attached, you interpret everything through hope, fear, and emotional investment. You excuse what feels wrong because you are still trying to preserve connection. You explain away inconsistency. You rationalize distance. Attachment blurs discernment because the heart is still bargaining for an outcome. Detachment, on the other hand, removes the bargaining. It allows you to observe without distortion. This is where clarity enters. Clarity doesn't shout, it doesn't accuse. It simply shows you what is aligned and what is not. When you detach, you are no ongoer emotionally fused to someone else's behavior. Their silence no longer sends you spiraling. Their inconsistency no longer feels personal. You stop asking, what did I do wrong? And start asking, is this healthy for me? That question alone dissolves confusion. Avoidants often misinterpret detachment as rejection because they are accustomed to being emotionally pursued. When that pursuit stops, they feel the shift immediately. But what they are sensing is not coldness, it is boundaries. Detachment communicates, without words, that you are no longer willing to suffer for proximity. There is nothing cruel about choosing not to bleed quietly. Detachment also frees you from the need to manage someone else's emotional capacity. You stop adjusting your expectations to match their limitations. You stop shrinking your needs to keep the peace. You stop overfunctioning to maintain balance. In detachment, you return responsibility to where it belongs. Each person becomes accountable for the own presence. This is not abandonment. This is self-respect. Clarity reveals patterns you could not see while attached. You begin to notice cycles instead of moments. You see repetition instead of potential. And once you see clearly, you cannot unsee. That is why detachment feels irreversible. It's not that your heart closed, it's that your eyes opened. There is also a spiritual principle at work. What is meant to be sustained does not require self-betrayal. When you detach, you align with truth rather than fantasy. You stop investing in who someone could be and start responding to who they are. That alignment brings peace, even when it brings loss. Avoidants struggle with this clarity because it removes emotional fog. There is no drama to hide in, no intensity to confuse intimacy. Detachment is quiet, and quiet exposes truth. For you, detachment becomes liberation. Your energy returns to your body. Your mind stops rehearsing conversations that never resolve. Your spirit steadies.
Yo,
fact, you are no longer trying to earn consistency, you are expecting it. And that expectation is not cruelty. It is self-honoring wisdom. Detachment says, I care enough about myself to stop pretending this doesn't hurt. And in that honesty, clarity becomes your guide. Reactivity is the fuel that keeps unhealthy dynamics alive. Every emotional spike, every defensive explanation, every impulsive response gives something to push against. When you react, you are still engaged in the exchange of power. But the moment you stop reacting, not because you are numb, but because you are grounded, manipulation loses its landing place. Manipulation depends on predictability. It relies on knowing which buttons to press, which silences will provoke anxiety, which mixed signals will pull you back into pursuit. When someone can anticipate your emotional response, they can steer the interaction without ever taking responsibility for their behavior. Your reactions become the mechanism through which control is maintained. When you stop reacting, that mechanism breaks. This does not mean you suppress your feelings or deny your emotions. Suppression is still a form of reaction turned inward. True non-reactivity comes from awareness. You feel what you feel, but you no longer externalize it in ways that give someone else leverage. You pause. You observe. You choose your response instead of being driven by impulse. That pause is powerful. In that pause, manipulation has nowhere to attach. Guilt loses its grip because you are no longer rushing to fix discomfort. Provocation falls flat because you are not seeking validation through engagement. Mixed signals lose their impact because you are no longer decoding them for meaning. The emotional hooks simply don't catch. Avoidants and manipulators alike are unsettled by this shift. They are accustomed to emotional feedback: anger, hurt, longing, reassurance. These responses confirm that they still matter, still have influence. Non-reactivity offers none respect for that. It creates a neutral field where intention is revealed through action alone. Without your reaction, words become hollow. Promises must stand on consistency. Silence must stand on truth. And this exposure can feel threatening to anyone who relied on emotional chaos to maintain control. For you, stopping reactivity restores inner authority. You stop outsourcing your emotional regulation. You no longer need someone else's behavior to determine your inner state. This is not emotional detachment from life, it is emotional sovereignty. There is also a deeper wisdom here. Not everything deserves a response. Some patterns repeat not because they are unresolved, but because they are being fed. When you stop reacting, you stop feeding what harms you. You allow it to reveal its true nature. This is why non-reactivity feels so decisive. It closes loops that endless conversations never could. It communicates boundaries without confrontation. It says, I am aware and I am no longer available. Respect for this exchange. Manipulation thrives in confusion. Non-reactivity creates clarity. When you are no longer emotionally available to be pulled, the dynamic either transforms or dissolves. And either outcome serves your growth. Stopping your reaction does not make you passive. It makes you intentional. It places choice back in your hands. You are no longer responding to emotional triggers, you are responding to truth. And when truth is met with calm, manipulation has no stage to perform on. Self-worth is the quiet force that dismantles dynamics built on instability. When you truly know your value, you no longer participate in emotional push-pull, because push-pull only survives where worth is being questioned. That dynamic depends on uncertainty, on moments of closeness followed by distance, on affection that arrives inconsistently, on attention that must be earned rather than given freely. The moment self-worth becomes rooted within you, that entire structure begins to collapse. Push. Pull works by activating doubt. One moment you feel chosen, the next you feel ignored. That fluctuation keeps you emotionally alert, scanning for signs, working harder to regain what was briefly offered. If your sense of worth is externally anchored, this cycle feels intoxicating and painful at the same time. But when self-worth is internalized, the fluctuation loses its power. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. Self-worth changes the questions you ask. Instead of wondering, why are they pulling away? You begin to ask, why am I staying where consistency is missing? That shift is everything. It moves you from reaction to evaluation, from emotional survival to conscious choice. And once that happens, the push-pull dynamic has nothing to attach to. Avoidants often rely on this dynamic unconsciously. Distance creates safety for them, while your pursuit reassures them they are still wanted. But when your self-worth is solid, you stop pursuing emotional breadcrumbs. You stop proving your value. You stop accepting partial presence as enough. Not because you are angry, but because your inner standard has changed. Self-worth teaches you that love does not require instability to feel real. You no longer romanticize emotional unpredictability. You recognize that calm, steady connection is not boring, it is secure. And once your nervous system aligns with that truth, push-pull begins to feel exhausting rather than exciting. This is where the dynamic dissolves. You don't have to announce your worth. You don't have to demand better treatment. Your energy communicates it for you. You respond differently. You tolerate less. You pause instead of chasing. And those subtle shifts send a clear message. I am not available for inconsistency. What makes this so powerful is that it is not conditional. You are no longer waiting for someone else to choose you so you can feel worthy. You have already chosen yourself, and from that place, any connection that requires self-due BT becomes unsustainable. Self-worth also removes fear from distance. When someone pulls away, you no longer panic. You don't rush to fix or reattach. You observe, you assess. And if the distance remains, you let it speak for itself. That calm response is deeply unsettling to dynamics built on emotional leverage. There is a deeper truth here. Push-pull only exists where there is permission for it to exist. Self-worth quietly revokes that permission. It replaces longing with alignment. It replaces hope with discernment. You stop investing in potential and start responding to reality. This doesn't harden your heart, it stabilizes it. You become open but not available to confusion, loving but not self-sacrificing, present but not chasing. And in that grounded state, the push-pull dynamic doesn't end with drama. It simply has no place to continue. Inner alignment is what happens when your thoughts, emotions, values, and actions begin moving in the same direction. It is the moment you start negotiating with your own discomfort and start honoring your internal truth. When this alignment takes place, emotional bargaining becomes unnecessary because you are no longer trying to convince anyone to meet you where you have already decided to stand. Emotional bargaining often sounds like quiet compromises with yourself. Maybe I'm asking for too much. If I explain it differently, they'll understand. If I wait a little longer, things will change. These negotiations are not really about the other person, they are about resisting your own knowing. They arise when your inner signals are clear, but your actions lag behind because attachment is still in control. Alignment closes that gap. When you are aligned, your body, intuition, and boundaries speak the same language. Discomfort is no longer something to override, it becomes information. You stop trying to reason your way out of what your nervous system already recognizes. And because of that, you no longer bargain for connection. At the cost of self-respect. Avoidants often benefit from emotional bargaining without consciously intending to. As long as you are negotiating your needs down, they don't have to rise to meet them. As long as you keep adjusting your expectations, the relationship remains comfortable for them and costly for you. But when alignment replaces bargaining, that imbalance becomes unsustainable. Alignment does not demand. It does not plead. It simply withdraws from what does not match its values. This is why it feels so definitive. You are no longer asking, will you change? You are asking, does this align with who I am? And if the answer is no, the conversation ends internally before it ever needs to happen externally. There is a deep peace that comes with this shift. Emotional bargaining keeps you mentally busy replaying conversations, imagining outcomes, calculating timing. Alignment quiets the mind because the decision has already been made. You no longer need reassurance when you our actions are rooted in truth. This is not emotional rigidity, it is emotional integrity. Inner alignment also restores self-trust. Each time you honor your truth instead of bargaining against it, you strengthen the relationship with yourself. You become less afraid of loss because you are no longer losing yourself to stay connected. And when self-trust is present, attachment loosens naturally. Avoidants often sense this shift immediately. They feel the absence of emotional negotiation. The space where you once compromised, waited, or explained is now filled with calm certainty. That certainty cannot be manipulated because it does not seek approval. There is also a spiritual principle at work. What is aligned does not beg to be chosen. Alignment attracts what resonates and repels what does not without force or conflict. When you are aligned, you stop chasing outcomes and start living in coherence. Emotional bargaining dissolves because it is no longer needed. You are no longer trying to, in fact, make something fit. You are allowing truth to determine what stays. And in that allowing, your energy stabilizes. You feel grounded, clear, and whole. Alignment does not make you less loving. It makes your love cleaner. It removes desperation and replaces it with presence. You give freely, but only where giving does not require self-erasure. And once alignment becomes your foundation, bargaining fades not because you gave up, but because you finally came home to yourself. Peace has a way of disrupting dynamics that chaos once sustained. When you choose peace not as avoidance, but as an inner state, you remove yourself from emotional turbulence that others may unconsciously rely on. For avoidance especially, emotional intensity can feel safer than emotional depth. Confusion, distance, and inconsistency create movement without requiring vulnerability. But peace brings stillness, and stillness reveals truth. Choosing peace means you stop participating in cycles that drain you. You no longer engage in arguments that go nowhere, nor do you chase clarity from those unwilling to provide it. Your calm becomes intentional, and that calm unsettles any dynamic that depended on your emotional agitation to stay alive. Peace does not argue. It does not defend itself. It does not compete for attention. It simply exists, and in its presence, everything misaligned becomes obvious. This is why peace is such a disruption. It removes the emotional noise that once masked imbalance. Avoidants often feel uncomfortable around peace because peace invites presence. It removes the distractions of drama and emotional swings. When you are peaceful, you are no longer pulling, pushing, or reacting. You are grounded. And that grounded state cannot be controlled through distance or inconsistency. What makes peace so powerful is that it changes your relationship to outcomes. You stop needing immediate answers. You stop fearing silence. You stop interpreting withdrawal as rejection. Peace anchors affect you in yourself rather than in someone else's behavior. And from that place, manipulation has no effect. This is not passivity. It is strength without aggression. Peace also clarifies your boundaries. When something disrupts your inner calm, you notice quickly. You no longer ignore red flags for the sake of connection. You do not justify discomfort as love. Peace becomes your internal compass, guiding you toward what feels stable, reciprocal, and real. For those accustomed to emotional chaos, your peace feels like a loss of control. They may attempt to provoke reactions, reintroduce intensity, or test your availability, but peace does not respond to bait. It does not need to prove anything. It simply remains steady. This steadiness forces a choice. Meet peace with presence or retreat from it. And either response reveals truth. There is also a deeper wisdom here. Peace is not something you find in another person, it is something you cultivate within yourself. When you stop outsourcing our emotional regulation, you reclaim authority over your inner world. That authority cannot be shaken by inconsistency. Peace is the ultimate disruption because it ends cycles without confrontation. It dissolves unhealthy patterns not by force but by refusal. You refuse to engage in what costs you your well-being. You refuse to explain what is already clear. You refuse to abandon yourself for connection. And in that refusal, something sacred happens. Your nervous system settles. Your mind clears. Your heart opens without fear. You become available for what is aligned and unavailable for what is not. Peace does not chase. Peace does not convince. Peace simply stands in truth. And when truth is embodied calmly, every game loses its power. So if there is anything to carry with you now, let it be this. The moment you chose yourself, you ended what never deserved your self-betrayal. Your calm was not weakness, your silence was not loss, and your peace was not accidental, it was earned. Saint, why anchored in that truth? Because what is aligned will meet you without pursuit, and what falls away was never meant to stay. Thank you for allowing these words to meet you where you are, for honoring your growth, and for choosing inner truth over emotional struggle. Walk forward grounded, clear, and whole. Goodbye, and remain in peace.